Welcome back, everybody. In this video, I'm talking about list transformation and list iteration. In other words, the difference between map and forEach and how we can use those to actually signal our intentions when we write code. So, starting off, we have a basic array of numbers. And then on line 5 here, we have an instance of calling map and passing in ag1. ag1 is a value transformation. It takes a value, increments it by 1, and then returns that value. It has no other side effects. So the only purpose of ag1 is to have an input and give back an output. So it's a pure function. Which means that the purpose of line 5 here is to assign a value to bigger nums. And that's because map takes values and returns values. On line 7 here, we're going to call forEach on this transformed list of numbers and pass in print. Print takes a value, and instead of returning something, it simply calls console log and passes in the value that was received to print. And so because forEach does not actually return anything, there is no purpose to returning something in this function, and so we are instead using it to console log. So if I run this code as it is currently, then we get 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each individually printed out, and that's because we started with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, transformed it on line 5, and then printed it on line 7. Nothing earth-shattering, but for anyone who was new to map and forEach, that's the technical difference. Map can do absolutely everything that forEach can do. You could actually replace every single forEach in a code base with map and it would still work. However, the purpose of this video is to explain why that would be overly confusing. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, on line 5 here, the purpose is to assign a value to this variable bigger nums. And so value assignment is going to be different than iterating over a list. Here we are doing something to the list, here we are doing something with the list. We are transforming the value, we are outputting the value. And so in this basic example, you can see the technical difference, but let me show you what it might look like if you were actually to choose one over the other and why you might want to do that. So here, we have a bunch of responses. These are imagined to be return values from an API call or something like that. And some of them are 500s, so some of them failed. And we want to count up how many failures we got. One way you could do that is the pure way. So on line 27 here, I'm assigning values to a variable called pure failures. And that just means that we are calculating them using a pure function. And so we are going to reduce our list of responses into a pure count. So we start with 0, and every time we see a 500, we will increment count by 1 and return that value. To look at the actual implementation, this is it here. Pretty straightforward. It's just going to test if there is a failure. So in other words, if the status was 500. And if it is a failure, then count gets increased by 1, and then counts, because it's the accumulator, will get passed back in, and this will continue to build or stay exactly the same if it's not a failure until the entire list has been passed over. And so the point here again is to assign a value to pure failures, the variable pure failures. Now the other way you could do it is to create a variable called impure, we're going to call it impure failures here, and give it a default value. You'll notice that the default value, or the initial value, is the same as the initial value on line 27 that we passed in to reduce. These will end up with these same answers. So on line 29 here, we are calling responses, so our list of objects up here, forEach impure count. And as you might expect, in impure count, what we are doing is testing if there's a failure. So this line is exactly the same as the pure version. And then if there is a failure, instead of returning a accumulating value, we are going to simply accumulate or increment the existing impure failures. So we are going to have a side effect outside of this function on another value in our scope. In this case, the impure failures. And so if I run this, then we get 4 and 4 because I'm console logging both out down here. So they both give us the same number, but why might you want to choose one over the other? And the purpose, in my opinion at this point, is to signal to other developers what the purpose of the function or line of code actually is. So in this case, I could assume that pure failures, the benefit of having a pure failures value is that we assigned it. So we calculated a value for it, we assigned it to this variable, and then we'll probably use pure failures somewhere else in our code. Because if we don't, we may as well just remove it. This line would otherwise serve no purpose. But on line 25, when we create an initial value for impure failures, and then later we signal that we are going to be iterating over the responses and having a side effect on impure failures, there's no way to tell where else impure failures could be used because this is actually tracking the state of our program. So impure failures is going to be something that we can reference elsewhere in our function or in our program, and the state of impure failures will have effects elsewhere. So this is then a shared variable that can update or could potentially be updated in multiple places. If it was only updated in one place on the same line of code, then we would use something like reduce or map. And so even if you could replace every forEach with a map and then just not return a value, that would give the false impression that what you're trying to do is something pure, whereas forEach signals specifically, because it can't be pure if it's a forEach because it doesn't offer a return value, that you are trying to do something that creates side effects. And there was definitely a period of time where I didn't use forEach for months. And then I joined a new team where this is a pattern, this line 29 and 25 pattern, where you are initializing a variable with a value and then updating that value elsewhere, where that was a common pattern. And I found myself using forEach or each in a third-party library a lot. And it was specifically to tell future developers, I am trying to create side effects in this block of code. And so you might say, all right, but why would I actually want to do that? Well, if we hop over to what I think it's in October 28th. Yes. What I have here is a very toned down version of what an Angular controller might look like. So we pass in a scope argument and pass in our responses. Our responses are very similar, except in this version of the code that I wrote, they're also 422s. So the failures could be 422s or 500s, and I'm just passing those in to our controller and then an empty object for our scope. And if you're not familiar with Angular 1, I'm also not an Angular 1 expert. I am new to the Angular ecosystem, and this is just a pattern that I've noticed works in the particular code base that I'm using, so I can't speak for all of Angular. But this is something I've seen, whereas when I first started on the team, I would have wanted to do something like this, where in order to create the scope.failures variable, I would have assigned it to responses.reduce and do the same calculation that we did in the other file. So this is exactly the same, except that it's doing a 422 and a 500 check. And that would give us the count of how many failures we had in this controller. And so if I were to run this, actually I should probably actually change directories, otherwise I'm going to have to type in something different every single time. So let me just hop over to that. All right, so if I were to run this, we get 4. Apparently it was still 4 failures. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, all right, fair enough. And yet, even though that gives us the correct value, that's not the standard in the code base that I'm now working in. This is the standard. To create a variable called scope.failures, assign it to a value, and then iterate over a list in order to have a side effect on that value. And if we run this, we get the same thing. So why would that be? Well, that's because it's important that we recognize this being a stateful component of our program. When you create a variable on the scope, you can also give it access. You can also give what's called the view, so what the user is interacting with. You can give the view access to these scope variables. And so if you are passing data, for example, the number of failures in a request, to the view, then the user probably needs to be shown how many failures occurred or something like that. But it could be something that's a bit more dynamic. So it could be something like the number of times that a user clicked on something. And so if we were, instead of failures, we were going to do something like scope user clicks, well, we're going to start that with 0. And then we might have multiple functions in this file that are going to listen for user clicks. Or there might be multiple places in our code base where user clicks could occur. And so it wouldn't make sense to assign user clicks a value with a map or a reduce, because that value is going to be changing. And so to assign it like this, we can, especially at the top of our scope, we are signaling to future developers. This is not a value that's going to be consistent based on different times in the execution of our code. This value is going to change. And so if it's going to be changing, we should probably treat it as a state, and we will adjust it using side effecting functions. So hopefully that was a bit more thorough on the difference between map and forEach, and why you shouldn't just see map as forEach that provides a return value, or forEach as map that doesn't provide a return value. They're meant for very distinctly different things. So map is meant for list transformation, where the benefit of a map is to assign a value to a variable, whereas forEach is used for list iteration, where the benefit is to have side effects. And that could be I/O, that could be changing of state in your program like we are doing here. It could be anything that's considered impure. And one more thing I should mention, if you are doing a map, and in that map you are also doing some side effects, I would say that you are better off, even if it creates a bit more code, splitting those things. Because if I see a map in a program, then I'm going to be assuming that the value of, or the purpose of that line of code is to assign a variable. So like in this line 12 here, this reduction, I assume no other side effects are occurring. It's just the value in scope.failures that's going to matter to me. And if that's not true, then I'm going to be thrown off by the use of map. So if you're using side effects, or if you're creating side effects, use forEach to signal to a developer. The only thing that could be happening in this block of code is side effecting, otherwise we might as well delete it. Otherwise, use map for pure computations. Hope that helps. I'll see you guys in the next video.